Well, to debrief what Biden just said, we can cross live to our Washington correspondent, Ketavan Gordestani, who's been listening in on the speech along with us. Ketavan, let's just talk about how Biden opened his State of the Union address. He started with Ukraine, with an expression of support for the Ukrainian people. Tell us more about what he had to say about the war in Ukraine.
Yes, he spoke for about 10 minutes about the war in Ukraine. It was the first theme that he spoke about, and he had some very tough words for President Putin, as well as for all the people who are around the Russian president who help him in this war in Ukraine. He said President Putin thought he could roll into Ukraine and that the world would roll over. Instead, he met a wall of strength he never imagined. Now, this speech, of course, started being written before this crisis really unfolded. And so this was something that was sort of added to the speech, a speech by Joe Biden talking about what he had talked about a lot during his campaign and ever since he took office, which is this battle between democracies and autocracies. He also talked about the strength of the NATO alliance. That was also one of his campaign themes, rebuilding the alliances, rebuilding the NATO alliance and the partnerships with his allies. And he spoke at length about that partnership and how they had come together to stand to face Russia, to sanction Russia. And he announced, confirmed some of the reports that came out just before his speech, confirming that the U.S. would indeed be banning its airspace to Russian aircraft, following in the footsteps of multiple European nations who have done so in recent days. There was also a very strong and powerful moment when he asked the ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., who was attending this speech, who was in the First Lady's box. He asked her to stand, and there was this standing ovation for that Ukrainian ambassador, really to show that the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans together on their feet, applauding the Ukrainian ambassador, and really as a symbol of how the United States was standing side by side with the Ukrainians. The president saying that they would continue helping as much as they could with military aid, humanitarian aid, support politically, support with sanctions on Russia. But one thing that the president repeated, a message that he has repeated over and over again, every time he addresses the war in Ukraine, he will not be sending U.S. troops in Ukraine to fight against the Russian. He will do everything in the U.S.'s power to stand strong with NATO forces, defend every inch of NATO territory, but he will not be sending U.S. troops in harm's way in Ukraine to fight Russia.
Yes, and Biden also looking to defend his reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying, quote, American diplomacy matters, American resolve matters, trying to show that his administration has responded well to this crisis.
Yes, and that was part of his speech, was to really focus and underline how much work diplomatically had been done. And it has to be said that there was a sort of unity, but that there was a lot of work between the United States, between the Europeans, between the NATO members, and all of that. Joe Biden talking about how they worked together, how they came together, overcame some of their differences, especially among some European allies, and how they really quickly got together to face Russia. And it was something, a message that had been repeated by the White House in recent days, which is that we've never seen NATO and the Europeans and the Americans get together so quickly and react so quickly. And I'm thinking back to a message from the president press secretary ahead of the speech, saying that Vladimir Putin really was the great unifier of NATO. And Joe Biden, in his State of the Union, underlined that effort working with allies, with partners. And that, again, goes back to his idea of, after 4 years of Donald Trump, where alliances were really put to the test, he really rebuild those alliances, those partnerships. You've been seeing Joe Biden talking to European leaders, to the Ukrainian leader, even to Russia's Vladimir Putin ahead of that invasion, to try to find a diplomatic way out, even though that didn't work. But it showed really how the Americans, in Joe Biden's words, when the Americans lead, they can do a lot with their European partners.
And Ketivan, let's shift now to some of the domestic issues he discussed. He talked about what he's done, talking about his COVID stimulus plan, the bipartisan infrastructure law, his Supreme Court nomination, nominating the first black woman to the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson, but also talking about what he wants to do. And that's the note he finished on, seeming like he was trying to reach across the aisle, laying out some nonpartisan goals there. How is he looking to unite Democrats and Republicans here?
Well, that is really the tricky part, because throughout this speech, you heard President Biden announce a lot of elements, whether there were for the economy, for fighting COVID-19. A lot of these elements, he said, I call on Congress to pass this and this bill. It was the same thing for voting rights, for example. He said, we are going to do this and that. He had a lot of plans, and he really laid out the way he sees the future. That said, the reality is that he right now has a very tight majority in Congress, a short majority in the House, a 50-50 tie in the Senate, broken by the vice president. And so he needs a lot of Republican support. And right now, there is no sign that he will get Republican support for many of the elements that he talked about. These are things that the Democrats have been wanting to pass. There are several of these bills that have been stalled in Congress. Of course, the Build Back Better completely stalled by the Republicans and by the Democrats. But even some of the point-by-point elements of that Build Back Better plan might not get enough support to be able to pass. The same thing goes for voting rights. He called on Congress to pass the two voting rights bill to protect voting rights in the United States. Those are also stalled in Congress, this time because of Republican opposition. So there wasn't really an idea of how he believes he can accomplish that, what could change from the past year and looking forward. And the thing is, of course, on the back of everyone's mind, even though he didn't really mention it in his speech, is the fact that the midterms are coming up very soon, November, just several months away. And it is widely expected that the Democrats are going to see some losses and possibly lose control of Congress. And so if he wasn't able to accomplish these things now, the question is, how will he get them to pass in the next few months? And that's a question that the president didn't really answer.
All right. France 24's Washington correspondent Ketivan Gorjestani reporting live for us there from the U.S. Capitol. Thank you so much for that analysis, Ketivan.